The Grand Assembly Hall floated in the void between star systems, a massive structure of crystalline metal that housed the Galactic Council's most important meetings. And today, every seat was filled with representatives from 847 different species who had traveled across known space to attend this historic session. Senior Archivist Kaleth stood at the central podium, her forearms gesturing at the holographic displays that surrounded her while her chitinous body gleamed under the chamber's soft lights, and she had spent 30 years of her life researching the great mystery that had puzzled galactic historians. For 15,000 years, what had happened to humanity? The humans had been legendary once. A species that exploded across the stars with frightening speed and ambition, building megastructures that still defied understanding and colonizing worlds at a pace that terrified their neighbors. But then, something changed, and within a single generation, they simply stopped. No more colony ships left Earth or any human world. No more transmissions echoed through space, and no more trade convoys traveled the established routes. And when other species finally worked up the courage to investigate the human territories, they found empty cities with lights still burning and automated systems still running, but not a single living human anywhere. The evidence suggests they did not die out. Keleth explained to the assembled delegates while her translator device converted her clicking speech into thousands of languages simultaneously. The infrastructure remained intact and functional for centuries after their disappearance, which would not be the case if disease or war had claimed them. She manipulated the holographic controls and brought up images of abandoned human stations and empty colonial domes that floated like ghosts in the darkness. I believe humanity chose isolation for reasons we cannot yet understand, but they did so deliberately and with careful planning. Many of the delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats because the idea of humans choosing to vanish was somehow more disturbing than the theory that they had destroyed themselves. And the Vren ambassador raised one of his tentacles to object, when suddenly every alarm in the assembly hall began screaming at once. Red emergency lights flooded the chamber while automated systems began evacuating atmosphere from certain sections and sealing bulkheads throughout the station. And the council's security chief appeared on every display screen with all 6 of his eyes wide, with what could only be described as terror. Something has emerged from dark space, he announced, while his voice cracked with stress, and his mandibles clicked rapidly in his species' expression of fear. The signature matches human origin, but that's impossible because the vessel is 20,000 years old. According to initial scans, the chamber erupted into chaos as delegates began shouting questions in hundreds of languages, while some species' natural fear responses triggered bioluminescent displays or pheromone releases that filled the air with contradictory scents. But Keleth remained frozen at her podium, staring at the data streaming across her personal display. 20,000 years old meant the ship predated humanity's known spacefaring civilization by thousands of years, which contradicted every archaeological finding and every piece of evidence in the historical record. Yet the quantum signature was unmistakably human, and the vessel's energy output suggested it was still fully operational. Its broadcasting. The security chief continued, while he manipulated controls off-screen, and the transmission began playing through the assembly hall's speakers. And every delegate fell silent, as an artificial voice spoke in ancient human standard language with translation protocols that were older than most of the species present. "This is the generation ship Endurance," the voice said with a flat, emotionless quality that somehow made the message more ominous. "We are humanity's Exodus fleet returning from our journey beyond the galactic rim, and we seek counsel with whatever galactic authority currently maintains order in this region." The voice paused, and in that silence Keleth could hear her own hearts beating in multiple rhythms while her breathing spiracles opened and closed rapidly. "We have been traveling for 20,000 years, and we bring warning of what we found in the darkness between galaxies." Another pause followed, and this time the voice carried something that the translation protocols struggled to convey, but that Keleth recognized as deep weariness. "We also bring solutions, and we hope desperately that we are not too late to share them." The transmission ended, and the assembly hall remained silent for several long moments before every delegate began speaking at once, while some demanded immediate military response and others called for diplomatic contact, and a few suggested fleeing the region. Enterilyketh watched the sensor data scroll past her eyes, and she saw details that made her academic. Heart raced with excitement despite the fear that gripped her. The ship was 50 kilometers long and showed signs of continuous habitation and modification over millennia. Its power output suggested technologies far beyond current galactic standards. And most incredibly, its hull showed evidence of traveling through regions of space that should have been impossible to survive. "We must speak with them," Kelleth said. Aloud, though, her voice was drowned out by the chaos around her. So she amplified her translator and repeated herself until the chamber quieted. "Whatever they are, and whatever happened to them, they have information that predates all of our civilizations." The council's high speaker called for order with the traditional chime that resonated through every species' hearing range. "The question before us is simple. Do we make contact, or do we treat this as a potential threat?" A heated debate followed with species whose ancestors had feared human expansion, arguing for caution, while others pointed out that any civilization capable of surviving 20,000 years in deep space deserved at least a conversation. And Kelleth found herself arguing passionately that humanity's disappearance and this ship's emergence could not be coincidence. Finally, the vote was called, and by a narrow margin the council agreed to send a diplomatic team to make first contact with the Endurance. And Kelleth was not surprised when she was selected to lead that team, given her expertise in human history and archaeology. 3 days later, she found herself aboard a council diplomatic vessel approaching the massive human ship, while her team of xenolinguists and cultural specialists prepared for what might be the most important first contact in galactic history. And as the Endurance grew larger in the view screen, Kelleth felt both excitement and dread, because she knew that whatever these humans told them would change everything. The ship was beautiful in a haunting way, with its hull showing the scars of 20 millennia, traveling through the void, yet still maintaining the geometric elegance that characterized human engineering. And as they drew closer, Kelleth could see forests growing behind transparent sections of hull and what appeared to be bodies of water contained within the wall. Massive structure, this was not just a ship, she realized with growing awe. This was a world unto itself that had journeyed farther and longer than any species in the current galaxy had ever attempted. And whatever humans awaited them inside had lived their entire lives, knowing nothing but the darkness between. The stars, the Endurance's docking bay doors, opened like the mouth of some ancient leviathan, and Kelleth's ship glided inside while automated systems guided them to a landing platform. And through the viewport she could see figures waiting in what appeared to be ceremonial dress that mixed ancient human military uniforms with decorative elements that must have evolved over countless generations. "Atmosphere is compatible," Pilot announced while checking the environmental readings. "They've matched our requirements." Exactly, which suggests they've been monitoring our biology and adjusting their systems accordingly. Kelleth straightened her ceremonial robes and made sure each of her forearms carried the appropriate diplomatic symbols before she moved toward the airlock. "Whatever happens, remember that these humans have sacrificed more than we can imagine to return here, and they deserve our respect and our attention." The airlock opened, and Kelleth stepped out to meet humanity's children who had endured the endless dark. Commander Sarah Chen stood at the end of the receiving line, wearing a uniform that blended ancient human naval traditions with practical modifications developed over 800 generations of continuous use. And her eyes held a depth that Kelleth had never seen in any being before, as if she carried the weight of 20,000 years in her gaze. "Welcome aboard the Endurance," Sarah said in flawless galactic standard, though her accent carried undertones of languages that had evolved in isolation for longer than most civilizations had existed. "I am Commander Sarah Chen, 43rd generational descendant of Captain Marcus Chen, who launched this vessel from Earth 20,000 years ago." Kelleth performed the traditional Sesith greeting with all four arms, while her translator worked to convey the proper respect and curiosity. "I am Senior Archivist Kelleth, representing the Galactic Council, and I must confess that your arrival has answered some questions while raising countless others." Sarah's expression flickered with something that might have been amusement or sadness, or perhaps both. "I imagine our existence contradicts much of what your historians believe about humanity's fate. And I promise we will explain everything, but first please allow us to offer you proper hospitality." because we have been traveling in the dark for so long that receiving guests feels like a dream. The diplomatic team was led through corridors that defied Keleth's expectations because instead of the sterile functionality she associated with spacecraft, these passages were decorated with artwork, spanning thousands of years of styles, and the walls themselves seemed to be grown from some organic technological hybrid material that pulsed with subtle bioluminescence. They passed through sections that contained actual forests with trees reaching 30 meters high beneath artificial suns that had burned for millennia. And Keleth saw children playing in parks, while adults tended gardens and elderly humans sat on benches feeding what appeared to be birds. Though she knew these creatures must be descendants of Earth species that had evolved in captivity for 800 generations, our population currently stands at 3 million souls, Sarah explained, while they walked through a residential district where buildings rose in architectural styles that showed clear evolution from ancient human designs. Every person aboard this ship was born here and will die here, except for the few who volunteered for the return journey, knowing they would never see Earth. She led them to an observation deck, where transparent aluminum provided a view of the galaxy they had returned to, and Keleth noticed that several humans stood silently staring at the stars with expressions of wonder mixed with grief. Most of our people have only seen the galaxy as a point of light in the distance, Sarah continued while her own eyes fixed on the starfield. For 20,000 years, we traveled through the void with nothing but darkness in every direction, and the memory of home growing fainter with each generation. Keleth felt her multiple hearts ache with empathy, because she could not imagine the isolation and the faith required to continue such a journey. Why did you leave, and why did you return now after so long? Sarah turned away from the viewport, and her expression hardened with determination. Come with me to the command center, and I will show you everything, because the galaxy needs to understand what we sacrificed and why we did it. The command center was a massive chamber that combined the functions of bridge, operations center, and research facility, and Keleth saw dozens of humans working at stations that displayed data in formats she recognized alongside completely alien interfaces that must have been developed during the long journey. Holographic displays filled the center of the room, showing maps of the galaxy alongside trajectory plots and sensor readings that dated back thousands of years. And Sarah moved to the central command station, where she initiated a presentation that would change galactic history. 20,000 years ago, Earth's most advanced scientists detected anomalies at the galactic rim. Sarah began while the displays showed spectroscopic data and gravitational measurements. Something was approaching from beyond our galaxy, and the calculations suggested it posed an existential threat to all life. The display shifted to show simulations of spreading darkness that consumed star systems in its path, while leaving nothing but void behind. The government refused to believe the findings because the threat was too distant and too theoretical, and most of humanity chose to ignore the warnings. Keleth watched the simulations with growing horror, while her scientific training allowed her to understand the implications of the data. But some believed? My ancestor, Captain Marcus Chen, believed, Sarah said with pride evident in her voice. He convinced a coalition of scientists, engineers, military personnel, and their families to build the Exodus fleet with Endurance as the flagship. And we launched in secret, carrying 3 million volunteers who were willing to abandon everything they knew. The displays showed images of the Endurance under construction in deep space, while smaller vessels gathered around it like children clustering near a parent. The plan was to travel beyond the galactic rim to observe the threat from a safe distance, and then return when it passed to warn whatever remained of galactic civilization. Sarah's expression grew haunted as the presentation continued. We traveled for 10,000 years before we realized the threat was moving slower than predicted, and we would need to travel farther than originally planned. So we continued outward into the intergalactic void where no light reached us, and our only companion was the darkness. Keleth saw images of the ship's interior over the centuries, celebrations and funerals, births and marriages, technological innovations and cultural evolution, all taking place within the same walls, while outside only blackness existed. Generations were born who never knew Earth except through stories and recordings. Sarah continued while her voice carried the weight of inherited memory. Children grew old and died, having spent their entire lives maintaining systems and preserving knowledge so that their children could do the same. And every generation accepted the burden because they believed in the mission. The displays showed the ship's population over time, periods of growth when resources were abundant and heartbreaking, declines when systems failed or disease struck. And Keleth realized she was witnessing a demographic history of impossible sacrifice. We lost 20,000 people to a reactor failure in year 6412, Sarah said while the displays showed memorial records. Another 30,000 to a plague in year 14,008. And countless individuals to accidents and age, and the psychological strain of knowing they would never see the journey's end. She paused and looked directly at Keleth, with eyes that had seen recordings of every tragedy and triumph across 800 generations. But we endured because that is what humans do when we commit to something. We endure beyond reason and beyond hope and beyond sanity itself. The presentation shifted to show recent data from the return journey. 500 years ago, we detected the first signs that the threat had entered the galaxy. And we immediately began the journey home, traveling at maximum sustainable speed. Keleth felt cold dread settle into. The threat is here now. It has been consuming the galaxy's rim for thousands of years. Sarah confirmed while the displays showed analysis of sensor data that the Council's own monitoring stations had collected but never properly interpreted. Your civilization has been too focused on internal politics and minor territorial disputes to notice that the darkness is approaching. She brought up a star map that showed hundreds of systems along the galactic rim, with each one marked in red. These star systems have gone dark over the past 3,000 years, and your records show them as sensor malfunctions or natural phenomena. But we know better. The map animated to show the progression of disappearances, forming a geometric pattern that pointed directly toward Council space like an arrow aimed at the heart of galactic civilization. At current rate of advancement, the phenomenon will reach your core worlds within 50 years. Keleth stared at the display while her mind raced through the implications, and her scientific training warred with her instinct to deny such a catastrophic prediction. The Council will need proof, and they will need time to analyze your data. We expected that, Sarah said while she activated controls that began transferring massive amounts of data to the diplomatic vessel's computers. We are providing complete records of our observations, along with the original threat assessment from 20,000 years ago, and all the refinements we have made during our journey. She met Keleth's gaze with fierce intensity. But understand this, we did not sacrifice 800 generations and travel 40,000 years round trip just to deliver a warning. We came back because we also bring the solution. Keleth felt hope kindle despite her fear. What solution? Sarah smiled for the first time since they had met, and it was a predator smile full of confidence and controlled violence. We are the children of humanity's warriors and scientists and engineers, and we have spent 20,000 years preparing for war against an enemy we have never seen. So trust me when I say that we know how to fight. The Galactic Council's emergency session convened within hours of Keleth's return. The massive assembly hall was packed with representatives who had traveled through quantum gates from across known space to hear what the humans had discovered. And the tension in the chamber was thick enough that Keleth could feel it pressing against her chitinous skin like physical weight. She stood at the central podium again, but this time, instead of presenting historical theories, she was delivering a potential death sentence for galactic civilization. And the holographic displays around her showed the data that Endurance had provided. 20,000 years of observations and calculations and projections. The phenomenon has been active for at least 3,000 years, Keleth explained while she highlighted systems on the galactic map that had been marked as inactive or lost to natural causes. Commander Chen's people have identified 217 star systems that have ceased all electromagnetic output with no debris fields and no evidence of supernova or other natural stellar death. The Vren ambassador, who had been skeptical of her human research, raised multiple tentacles in objection. Our own monitoring networks would have detected such a pattern if it existed, and I find it convenient that these humans appear after 20,000 years, claiming to be our saviors from a threat only they can see, several other delegates voiced. agreement, while some species representatives began displaying their natural aggression responses through colored changes or pheromone releases. And Keleth felt her own frustration rising because she had anticipated this resistance but understanding. It did not make dealing with it any easier. I had my team verify their data against our own records, she said, while activating a secondary display that showed Council monitoring station logs from the past 3 millennia. Every disappearance they identified corresponds to an entry in our database that was classified as equipment malfunction or sensor error. She manipulated the holographic controls to overlay the human analysis on top of the Council data, and the pattern became undeniable. A geometric progression of stellar deaths, moving inward from the galactic rim at a steady rate that suggested intention rather than natural phenomenon. The probability of this being random chance is less than 1 in 10 billion. Keleth continued while she highlighted the statistical analysis. Something is systematically erasing stars from the galaxy, and it is moving toward us. The assembly hall erupted into chaos with delegates shouting questions and accusations in hundreds of languages, while some species began demanding military mobilization, and others called for immediate evacuation of rim territories. And the High Speaker had to sound the order chime 3 times before any semblance of calm returned, even if we accept that this pattern exists. The cursed military coordinator said while his crystalline body refracted the chamber's light into sharp angles. We have no evidence of immediate threat, and no reason to trust humans who abandoned the galaxy. Millennia ago, before Keleth could respond, the chamber's alert systems activated again, and the security chief appeared on every display with an expression that conveyed pure terror across the xenobiological translation barrier. We are receiving an emergency transmission from Outpost. Vigilance on the Galactic Rim and the High Speaker should authorize immediate playback. The vote was unanimous, and the transmission began playing through the Assembly Hall speakers with video showing the Outpost's observation deck where 3 crew members stood staring at something beyond the viewport. And their body language communicated fear in a way that transcended species differences. This is Outpost Vigilance reporting a Class 1 anomaly, the lead observer said, while her voice shook despite obvious attempts at professional composure. We are observing direct evidence of stellar disruption in the Krath, a system approximately 4 light-years from our position. The video feed switched to external sensors, and Keleth felt her heart stop as she watched 3 stars simply cease to exist. No explosion or collapse or gradual dimming, but instantaneous transition from burning fusion to absolute void. And the darkness that remained seemed to be more than mere absence of light, as if reality itself had been erased. The phenomenon is advancing at points a road to parsecs per standard day. The observer continued while the external sensors showed the spreading void. Gravitational readings are impossible because there is nothing there, no mass, and no energy, and no quantum foam. Just nothing. The transmission quality began degrading as interference washed across the signal, and the observers started backing away from the viewport, while their instruments showed the void approaching their position. We are evacuating immediately and requesting emergency extraction for all rim territories within 10 light-years of our position. Static consumed the transmission, and then silence fell across the assembly hall as every delegate processed what they had witnessed. And Keleth saw the exact moment when denial became impossible. When abstract data transformed into visceral reality that could not be explained away or ignored. How long until it reaches populated systems? The High Speaker asked while his voice carried the weight of responsibility for 847. Civilization Skelf brought up the projection models that Sarah Chen had provided, and she felt sick as she read the numbers aloud. At current rate of advancement, the void will reach the first major population centers within 50 years and will consume the entire galaxy within 2,000 years unless it is stopped. The silence that followed was deeper than any Keleth had experienced, because it was the silence of civilizations confronting their own mortality. And she watched delegates from species that had existed for millions of years realize that their time might be measured in decades. The humans claim they have a solution. The Vren ambassador said quietly while his earlier hostility had been replaced by desperate hope. What are they offering? Keleth activated the final segment of her presentation, and Sarah Chen's recorded message began playing on every display throughout the chamber. My people have spent 20,000 years preparing for this moment, and we offer the Galactic Council everything we have learned. Sarah's image was flanked by holographic displays, showing weapon systems and defensive technologies and strategic doctrines that made several of the Council's military coordinators lean forward with obvious interest. Endurance is not merely a refugee ship. It is a mobile research facility and manufacturing center that has been continuously developing military technology for 800 generations. The displays showed specifications for energy shields that could theoretically withstand stellar-level impacts and weapons, capable of disrupting quantum fields at planetary distances, and propulsion systems that exceeded anything in current galactic use by several orders of magnitude. We preserved every advancement humanity made during our expansionist era. Sarah continued while the displays cycled through thousands of weapon designs and tactical manuals. We also improved and refined these technologies during our journey because we knew we might need to fight something beyond conventional understanding. She paused, and her expression hardened with determination that Keleth had come to recognize as fundamentally human. But we cannot save the galaxy alone. We need your resources and your manufacturing capacity and your personnel. So we propose full integration with the Galactic Council in exchange for complete access to our military knowledge. The recorded message ended, and real-time transmission connected as Sarah herself appeared on the displays. Speaking from Endurance's command center, I am authorized to begin immediate technology transfer if the Council agrees to our terms. Full membership for humanity and resource allocation to construct a defensive fleet. The debate that followed was the most intense Keleth had witnessed in her 30 years of Council service, because species that had feared human expansion now faced the choice of accepting human help or facing extinction alone. And the arguments touched on everything from historical grievances to philosophical questions about the nature of survival. Sisith delegation, which Keleth advised, argued passionately that humanity had earned consideration through their sacrifice and their willingness to share knowledge freely, while more conservative species worried about rearming a civilization that had once threatened galactic stability. These are not the humans of 20,000 years ago, Keleth found herself saying during a brief moment when the chamber fell quiet. They are the descendants of people who chose duty over comfort and sacrifice over safety. And they spent 800 generations preparing to save a galaxy that had forgotten they existed. She manipulated the displays to show images from interior, the forests and cities, and memorials to those who had died during the long journey. Every person aboard that ship is here because their ancestors believed that galactic civilization was worth saving, and I believe we should honor that faith. The vote was called, and Keleth watched the tally appear on the central display while her multiple hearts beat in syncopated rhythms. Species after species registered their decision until finally the count exceeded the required threshold for Council action. The massive orbital shipyard designated Construction Platform 7 had been repurposed from commercial vessel production to military manufacturing within weeks of the Council vote. And Sarah Chen walked through corridors that now echoed with the sounds of humanity's knowledge being transformed into physical defenses. She passed workstations where human engineers collaborated with Vren metallurgists to create hull plating that could theoretically withstand the void's reality erasing effects. And she saw Kurseth energy specialists working alongside human physicists to develop shield generators that operated on principles that Galaxy had never explored. The cultural integration is proceeding better than projected, reported Lieutenant James Morrison, who served as Sarah's administrative coordinator and who represented the 42nd generation of his family line aboard Endurance. We have had minimal conflicts between human personnel and galactic species, with most disagreements resolved through mutual respect protocols. Sarah nodded while reviewing production schedules on her portable display because every day mattered. When the void continued its inexorable advance toward populated space. What about the technology transfer? Are our galactic partners able to understand and implement the designs we have provided? Better than expected? James replied while pulling up efficiency reports that showed manufacturing output exceeding initial projections. Many species brought engineering perspectives we never considered during our isolation, and the collaborative approach is producing innovations that pure human Design would have missed. They entered the main observation gallery, where transparent aluminum provided views of the construction bays, and Sarah felt pride watching the first defensive platforms, taking shape under the combined efforts of dozens of species working toward a common goal. How many platforms will be operational within the first year? Current projections suggest 47 full defensive stations, with another 120 in various stages of completion, James said while highlighting the relevant data. Each platform incorporates human shield technology with galactic power generation systems, creating a hybrid design that exceeds either civilization's individual capabilities. Sarah studied the specifications and saw exactly what James meant. The platforms used human-designed quantum field generators powered by SciFi antimatter reactors and controlled through cursed crystalline computing networks, creating something genuinely new rather than merely copying old designs. Humanity's gift to the galaxy is not just our weapons, she said while watching a massive shield generator being installed on the nearest platform. It is the demonstration that cooperation produces better results than isolation. The observation gallery's doors opened, and Kelleth entered, accompanied by several council military coordinators who had become regular collaborators during the construction effort. Commander Chen, we need to discuss the timeline for testing the defensive network. Sarah gestured for them to join her at the display table, where holographic projections showed the planned deployment of platforms across the galactic rim. We are ahead of schedule on construction, but I remain concerned about coordination between platforms. We need each station to function as part of a unified network, rather than independent units. The Curseth coordinator, whose name translated roughly, "Two Bright Edge," manipulated the holographic controls to show communication protocols. We have adapted human tactical doctrine to galactic command structures and preliminary simulations. It's just 93% efficiency in coordinated defensive operations. Simulations are not combat, Sarah replied while her 20,000 years of inherited military knowledge made her cautious about overconfidence. We need live testing against actual threats before we can rely on these systems. Kelleth's optical organs focused with the intensity Sarah had learned to recognize as deep concern. The void continues advancing, and we have lost another 6 systems. In the past month, we cannot afford extensive testing when lives are at stake. Sarah felt the familiar tension between caution and urgency that had defined human decision-making throughout the long journey. Then we test with minimal platforms and scale up based on results, because deploying untested systems across the entire rim risks catastrophic failure at the worst possible moment. The debate continued for hours as they refined deployment schedules and testing protocols while balancing the need for certainty against the pressure of approaching doom. And Sarah was reminded again that leadership meant making impossible choices with incomplete information. 3 months later, the first test occurred at Outpost Remembrance, which had been established at the site where Outpost Vigilance had transmitted its final warning, and Sarah watched from Endurance's command center as 6 defensive platforms activated their shield network around a section of space. Directly in the void's path, all platforms reporting full operational status, reported the human technical coordinator, while her voice carried across the communication channel connecting dozens of species monitoring the test. Shield network forming at 97% projected strength. The holographic displays showed the quantum field generators creating a barrier that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously, not just blocking physical matter, but reinforcing reality itself against the void's erasing effect. Void contact in 30 seconds, announced the SciFi observer stationed at the furthest monitoring post. And Sarah felt her heart rate increase despite her training, because this moment would determine whether 800 generations of preparation had produced something capable of actually stopping the threat. The void reached the shield network, and for several seconds nothing visible happened, while sensors struggled to measure the interaction between reality erasing nothing and quantum reinforced something. And then the displays lit up with data showing energy expenditure rates that made several coordinators gasp. Shield network holding, technical coordinator said, while her voice carried relief and tension in equal measure. Power consumption is higher than projected, but within sustainable parameters. Sarah watched the data stream across her displays, and she saw the shields flickering under strain but maintaining coherence while the void pressed against them like water against a dam. How long can the platforms sustain this output? Current power reserves allow for approximately 48 hours of continuous operation. Brightedge replied while his crystalline body refracted the command center's lights into complex patterns. After that, we will need to rotate platforms to allow recharging cycles. The test continued for 6 hours before. Sarah ordered the network to deactivate and allow the void to pass because they had proven the concept worked and prolonged. Exposure risked depleting resources needed for final deployment. And when the shields dropped, she saw that the void had advanced exactly as predicted. It's unstoppable, but no longer unopposed. We can hold the line. She announced to the assembled coordinators, while allowing herself a moment of genuine hope. With sufficient platforms and proper coordination, we can create a defensive perimeter that will protect populated space. Kelleth approached after the others had departed to begin scaling up production based on the successful test. You should be proud of what your people have accomplished, Sarah felt the weight of 20,000 years pressing on her shoulders. Because pride seemed premature when the real battle had not yet begun, we have proven we can delay the void, but we have not yet determined how to stop it permanently. Buying time is not the same as achieving victory. Sometimes buying time is enough. Kelleth replied while her forearms gestured in patterns that conveyed philosophical acceptance. My species has a saying. The tree that survives the storm does so by bending rather than breaking. And perhaps our victory will come from endurance, rather than overwhelming force. Sarah smiled because she recognized the truth in those words, and she thought about the 800 generations who had endured the darkness through patience and determination. Humanity learned that lesson across 20,000 years, so perhaps we are uniquely suited to teach the galaxy how to survive through stubbornness. The construction effort intensified over the following year as more shipyards converted to military production, and more species contributed their unique capabilities to the collaborative defense. And Sarah watched humanity's population swell as additional sleeper ships awakened and colonists spread across council territories. Humans integrated into galactic society with surprising ease despite 20,000 years of isolation because the Exodus fleet's people had been selected for adaptability and cooperation. And Sarah saw human children playing with alien children in parks that spanned multiple worlds, while their parents worked side by side in factories and laboratories. The defensive network grew to encompass 370 platforms, forming a barrier across 2,000 light-years of galactic rim. And Sarah commanded coordination drills that brought together crews from dozens of species, operating in perfect synchronization. 27 years had passed since the defensive network's activation, and Sarah Chen stood in Endurance's command center with gray streaking her hair in lines etched deep around her eyes from decades of bearing responsibility for galactic survival. And she watched the sensor displays showing what her worst predictions had warned would eventually come. The void had changed and evolved and adapted until it was no longer simply erasing reality but actively manipulating it, creating tendrils of nothing that probed the defensive network, searching for weaknesses while the main mass continued its inexorable advance. Platform 73 is reporting shield degradation exceeding safety parameters, announced Lieutenant Morrison, who had aged alongside Sarah and who now carried scars from a dozen crisis responses. They are requesting permission to fall back to secondary positions. Sarah studied the tactical display while her mind processed variables that included power reserves and crew fatigue and the geometric consequences of creating gaps in the defensive line. Denied. If they fall back, the void will exploit the opening and we will lose the entire sector. She opened communication channels to platform 73, where Commander Tesh led a mixed crew of humans and Vren who had been holding their position against impossible pressure for 6 continuous months. Commander, I need you to hold for another 48 hours while reinforcements cycle through recharge sequences. Tech's response came through with the exhaustion evident in her voice regardless of species translation protocols. Understood. Commander Chen, we will hold until the shields fail or the void retreats. Sarah felt the weight of sending people to potential death settle into her bones because she had made this choice hundreds of times over the past decades, and each time it became harder rather than easier. I am authorizing full emergency power allocation from the grid. Draw whatever you need to maintain shield integrity, the defensive line held, but Sarah knew from analyzing the Void's behavior patterns that this was merely preparation for something larger, and her suspicions were confirmed when long-range sensors detected a massive concentration of Void energy. Gathering at the periphery of the defensive network, analysis suggests the Void is preparing a coordinated assault across multiple sectors simultaneously, reported the cursed tactical coordinator whose crystalline structure had grown darker over years of stress. Projected impact will exceed our defensive capacity by a factor of 3. Sarah felt cold certainty settle over her because she had known this moment would come eventually, the moment when defensive holding became impossible and offense became the only option for survival. She activated the priority communication channel that connected directly to the Galactic Council's emergency assembly. This is Commander Chen requesting immediate authorization for deployment of Protocol Endurance. We are out of time and out of options. The High Speaker's image appeared on her display with the weight of 847 civilizations visible in his expression. Commander, the Council has reviewed your proposal, and the ethical implications are severe. You certain there's no alternative? The Void will breach our defenses within 72 hours, Sarah replied, while pulling up the tactical projections. That showed the defensive network collapsing under concentrated assault. Protocol Endurance is the only weapon we have developed that can strike at the Void's core and potentially destroy it. Permanently, the silence that followed stretched for nearly a minute before the High Speaker spoke again. The Council authorizes Protocol Endurance with the understanding that you bear full responsibility for the consequences. May whatever powers exist in this universe guide your hand, Sarah. Close the channel and turn to face her command crew who had served with her through decades of crisis and who understood what Protocol Endurance actually meant. Begin evacuation procedures for all non-essential personnel. I want every person who is not critical to the mission off the ship within 24 hours. Lieutenant Morrison stepped forward with determination overriding the fear visible in his eyes. Commander, with respect, Endurance has been my home for my entire life, and I request permission to remain aboard for the final operation. Around the command center, dozens of other crew members echoed his request while humans and aliens alike volunteered to stay aboard the ship that had become a symbol of humanity's endurance in the galaxies. Hope Sarah felt tears threatening because she had known her crew well enough to predict this response, but hoping she was wrong. Protocol Endurance requires endurance itself to become the delivery mechanism for a stellar compression warhead that will create a controlled microquasar at the Void's core. She paused to let them process the implications that the ship would be destroyed and everyone aboard would die. I cannot order you to volunteer for a suicide mission, so anyone who wishes to evacuate has my blessing and my gratitude for their service. The command center remained silent for several heartbeats before Morrison spoke for all of them. Commander, this ship has been traveling toward this moment for 20,000 years, and every generation before us accepted that they might be the ones who had to make the final sacrifice. He gestured to encompass the entire crew. We are the children of 800 generations of people who chose duty over survival, and we will not dishonor their memory by abandoning the mission when it matters most. Sarah felt pride and grief warring in her chest because she had never wanted to lead people to their deaths, but she also understood that sometimes leadership meant accepting the sacrifice others chose to make. Very well. All personnel who wish to evacuate have 12 hours to transfer to support vessels, and all volunteers remaining aboard should prepare for final combat operations. The evacuation proceeded with military efficiency as nearly 2 million people transferred from Endurance to the fleet of support ships that had gathered around humanity's ancient vessel. And Sarah walked through corridors that had been filled with life for 20,000 years, knowing that soon they would be silent forever. She visited the forests one last time and saw the trees that had grown from seeds brought from Earth millennia ago. And she stood beside the memorials to those who had died during the long journey, while promising them that their sacrifice would not be wasted. When the evacuation deadline passed, 10,000 volunteers remained aboard Endurance, including the entire command crew and representatives from 40 different species who had chosen to stand with humanity at the end. And Sarah felt humbled by their faith even as she prepared to lead them into oblivion. All systems are configured for Protocol Endurance. reported the human engineering chief, while his voice remained steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. The stellar compression warhead is charging. Will reach critical mass in approximately 6 hours. Sarah settled into the command chair that had been occupied by 43 generations of her family, and she opened fleet-wide communications to address the defensive network one final time. All platforms, this is Commander Chen. Endurance is beginning final approach to the Void's core, and we will create an opening for the warhead deployment. She paused while checking the tactical displays showing the Void's assault beginning across the entire defensive perimeter. Hold the line for 6 more hours, and give us the time we need to end this threat permanently. Yes. The responses came from hundreds of platforms as crews who had fought beside Endurance for decades pledged to hold their positions regardless of cost, and Sarah felt the connection between all those who had chosen to stand. Against the darkness, Endurance broke from the defensive line and accelerated toward the Void's core, while its shields blazed with energy as reality-erasing tendrils lashed against quantum barriers. And Sarah watched the external sensors showing her ship approaching the heart of the threat that had driven humanity into exile 20,000 years. A Go Void concentration ahead is beyond measurement, announced the Seseth sensor operator, while her forearms worked multiple control stations simultaneously. We are effectively flying into pure nothing and hoping our shields hold long enough to reach optimal detonation position. The ship shuddered as void energy found microscopic weaknesses in the shield network and began eroding sections of hull plating. But the volunteers maintained their positions and continued feeding power to systems that were never designed to endure such extreme conditions. Warhead approaching critical mass, the engineering chief reported while warning indicators lit up across every station. Detonation sequence can be initiated on your command. Sarah watched the tactical display showing Endurance penetrating deep into the Void's core, while around them the defensive network fought desperately to hold the line. And she thought about Captain Marcus Chen, who had sent humanity into the darkness 20,000 years ago, trusting that his descendants would know what to do when the moment came. All hands, this is Commander Chen, she said while opening communications throughout the ship so everyone could hear her final words. In 30 seconds, we will initiate Protocol Endurance, and this ship that has been our home and our heritage will become our weapon.